Hello everyone, today we review Walpurgisnacht, a novel by the Austrian author Gustav Meyrink, active between the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, that I thought to be quite nice, first of all, because this is between April the 30th and May the 1st. You have properly the night of Walpurga. That actually is a historical celebration dating back to the Middle Ages. The translation of Saint Walpurga, effectively the evangelization of Thuringia, celebrated traditionally in several countries in honor of the saint, with bonfires that basically exemplified the stakes burning in the triumph of the universal imperial Catholic tradition over witchcraft and the forces of evil, the chthonic, demonic, Dionysian forces that get basically buried, but as you know, that for tradition need to be re-evoked at some point and tamed to achieve transfiguration. That naturally has also pre-Christian roots, because these were the great bonfires of May that have a lot to do. There is the other night of the witches, is the one in which I was actually born. I actually was born in the later one, and that is St. John's, June the 24th, which has similar meaning with the the summer solstice and all these things, and we can delve in that in some other video, because I never discussed the stuff. But I thought this novel is fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all, Meyrink, for those who know him, was essentially interested in the occult, right? And so I, as you know, have come closer from some years at least through my following my vein of historic or religious studies in a greater insight in traditional religion, and framing most of what is called as occult, that basically today is intended in a vulgar sense just from both sides of the aisle as Satanism, which has actually nothing to do with that. And that's why I think that this book's analysis is quite fascinating, because it really speaks in that subtle enough way that I often urge my audience to reflect, like when thinking about the duality of the system and how easy it is to be tricked, right? And how this is properly the entire point of what we call as occult. So something that has to be discovered, simply. It has to be unveiled, it has to be researched and clarified. So not in a involutive, destructive way, in a sort of prevalence of the forces of chaos and of evil, but on the contrary, right, in a positive, authoritative, rational, Apollonian, affirmative way, which I think is the deal for any successful existence, in spite of our limits, that in fact are very much what you feel when you read this book, and that's what makes it really fascinating, right? This novel has been is somehow famous, right? I'm not a huge literature. I mostly study history, right? For more than a decade, most of the things I read are hardly literary, even though I do have many literary interests, but most of them stopped back when I was an adolescent, and it is provided perhaps at the highest in Meyrink's work with sort of thrilling, right, a sort of nightmare atmosphere of malaise or of some kind of illusory, in fact, imagery that makes you live in this book as a bit of a comprehensive hallucination, right? And I appreciated this work enough, if anything, because it touches many of the traditional points that we make in every video, and that, in my opinion, is quite eloquent, and that big spoiler. Of course, we're going to criticize the whole book, so if you want to read it first and listening to my videos later, it's okay. So leave now if you have to. But I think in the end has a pretty unequivocal meaning, right? The criticism, the interpretation of this book, as far as I understand, is still suspect in a way. And I think that it is a testament to the opposite of what normally this work is read like and for, right? You read Walpurgisnacht, and therefore you associate this to the Legion again, of the unleashing of evil in that night, as a sort of this is present also in Faust. There are many local traditions in the Czech Republic, for example, connected with love, with some in fact traditions. Calling traditions in part are superstitions, telling you the truth, but they reflect the folklore that naturally develops around these events and their meanings. So again, I'm not going to descend in that as much, because technically this book is not even about the night of Walpurga, right? It's something different. It gets close to that. And there are a couple of central thoughts that are important to analyze here. There is a symbolic meaning in this book, definitely, an occult background or content, which, again, does not have to be understood as, again, every time you read about stuff that reminds you to witchcraft, the same Walpurgisnacht is literally after the Catholic saint, right? So it's not about what this kind of chthonic fortestator obsession with, essentially a communistic anti-authority witchcraft delusion is basically gets down to. It's meant to be a serious thing and to make us reflect on how much, in fact, of what we think we know is not quite the thing, but still not giving way to the forces of the darkness, but actually strengthening in power to the forces of the light. And there is definitely, for this reason, in the work of Meyrink, something unique that can be extended to his entire production. In fact, their genre that differentiates itself consistently from the sensationalism, let's say, that you can find in Poe, for example, in Hoffman, Lovecraft, etc. Right. So according to the legends of the past, this, as we've seen, the Walpurgisnacht is the one in which demonic forces are released and act in a sort of unbridled tragenda, right? And something like this is definitely reflected in the events in the book. There is definitely a climax, at least there is a sort of underlying tension that is present in also the setting, which is quite fascinating in itself, because the novel takes place in Prague in 1917, specifically in the Vrachany, in the castle, in the old town, because mostly among the nobility, right, of the older empire, that basically lives in a sort of sclerotised fashion from this side of the Moldova River, in their tradition, in their with their status, with their privilege, and so on, and are basically terrified to go out there in the new town, what they call the world, among the lesser people, and because essentially the devil lives there. And all this is set, in fact, during World War I, in fact, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and with this looming ghost of the socialist revolution in the same Prague that naturally these aristocrats were loathing, for which they would have gladly massacred, all the anarchy, the socialists, and so on. and that at some point, in fact, is unleashed, and this is the parallelism existing with Walpurgisnacht, even though it happens later on, a month later, and so that's why actually the novel has not much to do with. There is probably the Walpurgisnacht, and brings the situation to a crisis, naturally, that affects the characters in the story pretty heavily. So the Walpurgisnacht becomes a symbol, right, in the existence of these people, in that moment in which basically the chains, the divides, the everything that in fact symbolizes the earthly conventions evaporates for a reason, with enormous destruction, in fact, which symbolizes the essentially the power and the responsibility that are required to leadership to maintain a grip on the world, right? There is a recurrent say imagery here, because most of the story takes place in this aristocratic milieu, with the characters referring a bit to the history of Bohemia, the 30 Years' War, the Hussite Wars, especially the latter, having and also older times. So that's why this is quite fascinating for our also medieval historical interests, and that depicts, in fact, this Bohemian context a bit in that kind of sense of middle land of civilization between the West and the East, between the civilization and the steppe, if you want, this blood that boils within the Bohemian veins, the sense of the heavy past of again, think about Jan Žižka, that is actually evoked, as we will see, as a spirit and leading to the socialist revolution in this context. And that's quite fascinating because, as you know, we've seen in our videos, the Hussites didn't really do much good, but again, because of the Fourth Estate and nationalist socialist delusions of the lesser people, this can be interpreted both as a kind of a symbol of a country, even though it destroyed the country, right? And of course, wrestling against the imperial traditional unity rather than doing anything positive in that sense. But this is the meaning of Walpurgisnacht as well, because it shows how much is actually required to the elites, to the Apollonian, to the authority to remain in charge, right? The aristocracy here is Meyrink has a very artistic way of depicting these characters that are a bit I can't say surreal, but they are a bit characters of themselves. They are mostly, not all, because there are also younger elements, as we'll see now, but as they are in charge, as mostly if mature, if not elderly people in their entirety, being extremely rigid, fundamentally sclerotized within themselves, and so representing, and this is beautiful if you think that, again, this is just 1 year away from the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but more of the feudal the medieval establishment, if you want, of millenary era. And so we know how things went eventually. This is an incredibly, it's one of the most beautiful settings possible, because it goes to the extreme, to the chronological extreme of that world that I tell you all the time, to me having ended as the Middle Ages just in 1919, right, and still being alive in certain areas of Europe up to that point. And again, exemplifying how much, and this is the purely, and Meyrink was surely aware of this, the purely traditional meaning of this all is that the light cannot win if it cannot manage to tame the darkness. Right now, what is interesting is that this book, of course, doesn't deal with because it takes place also in a few months within 1917, with the end of the war, the dissolution of the empire, and all these things. But it does speak definitely to the heart of a dying world that still, however, has it by a certain reason, because the way the crisis is concluded in the novel, at least, speaks clearly about whose side power really is, and it is definitely not from the side of the socialists. At least there is an establishment, and it is very well able of making a manslaughter to maintain it standing. So it shows pretty clearly from which side reason is maintained. But it is done again within a context in which most people are inadequate. This is what most of the establishment is inadequate. This is what I discussed in those videos about, for example, the French Revolution, right, between modernity and tradition. The fact that tradition decayed is not something you can blame somebody else for, because technically, if you were capable of inverting the system, and you should, if you really want to follow the absolute extreme, that is the one of the truth and the one of the boundless faith and self-actualization, you would be able to fix the thing yourself, right? So in my opinion, Meyrink understood this as well. He was showing an establishment that was too weak to be threatened essentially by the lowest, most vile sources of mankind, so of course communism, socialism, and so masses without a head meant literally as, the dignity of human intelligence, and still, however, fearing this whole world to be essentially permeated by forces, because this is where what really the novel gets down to, that are put in motion, and most of the debate here lays on who puts in motion and how, and that we're succumbing, right? This is a very pessimistic novel, right? The ultimate meaning of that, as we will see, is that it doesn't end well after all, right? There is still something that holds, that can't be seen as tradition in some formal way, but there is essentially no chance for mankind at this point, or at least according to tradition, the end of time. The end time is near. The age of the wolf, the end of the fourth age, arrives at a point in which mankind has been sensibly weakened to the point of being extremely fragile, just being prey of itself, and especially not being able to live a life that, even within the Apollonian ideal, is able to confront itself with the Dionysian, and thus is not able to control the world, right? Because the Dionysian can't control the world itself; it can only destroy, right? But for this reason, the world is somehow pretty unstable, is disintegrated, is degenerating, and the protagonists, the characters of this novel, are basically in the midst of this, right? What is fascinating of this is that it's not represented towards, let's say, through a clearly evident sense of, like, pretty graphic sense of how things are falling apart, right? Just the conclusion of the end of the novel is pretty dramatic. There is actual bloodshed, and even there, nothing really happens, because this revolt will be put down. Things will sort of come back like they were, in spite of how we know history went on in those lands, etc. So worsening. But this is not the point. The novel naturally focuses on this specific segment of time, and showing how, of course, there is a sort of, if not a cyclicity, but at least an organic, say, development, right, of these events, where there is at some point a sort of sacrifice, a scapegoat, somebody that must be taken out in order to refreshen, let's say, the world with this horrendous tribute of blood, right, and of human life, of which we are all collectively guilty of, right, sinfully, as a fallen kind, as humans, so as the dirty ones, and I think that the contrast is fascinating, because otherwise most of the novel talks about relatively pleasant events where nothing terrible or dramatic really happens. However, introspectively, all the characters have the sense of existential malaise, of mal de vivre, we could say, and that things are ruinously going down. Basically, that they are not able to catch up with the divine standard, the absolute standard, that they are the ones who are supposed to be actually guarded, right? Because they are defending the imperial monarchy. They are defending tradition, again, in historical times, where all these aristocrats are aware of the blood, what happened during the 30 Years' War, all the steps, again, that European tradition took towards the generation of the system, and like the entire world, and some world hardly ever, that began much longer. And in Europe, actually, we are somehow more sensitive to this, because we're aware that we are the ones who still got it and have been getting it right from quite a while, and then that things are just going down hopelessly, if for us, for everybody around, right? Because the world is not going to be stronger or better or more successful with the collapse of the civilization that the West has brought. And so there seems to be this sense quite strongly out there. And considering that the novel was written back then too, this is fascinating, because it's as if we were basically confronted with the same problems at the time nowadays, and that shows you the linearity of the process after all. It's not a particularly long work, right? But it's dense. The Walpurgisnacht becomes a symbol in a true character of the novel here that is quite enigmatic. This is Zrcadlo, which in Czech, if I pronounce it correctly, means mirror, meaningfully enough. This is a man, right? At least here in this world, you never, described by Meyrink, you never understand whether things are real or not, because the effect that must be given here is that, again, things are occult, right? That we see, we experience sensorially what happens right around us, but we can never be completely sure about what things are really, what things really are, right? There is a sense that the entire matter is permeated with some sort of forces, right? Of spirits. This is also goes from the biggest thing, right? The idea that under Pragal, the blood that passed under the bridges is going to reemerge in a collective massacre, and so with the end of the world and the end of tradition and things like that, to very pathetic things like, as we will see now also in the character of Flugbile, that is basically the protagonist. It can get down to literally the objects you have in your room that seem, I don't know, some luggage that seems like a monster that opens his mouth, and so none of this is this latter aspect of the animation, even of matter, is fascinating, because it's very recurrent in the book, but equally, just like in the contrast between the unleashment of evil and most of the normality that also, and the calmness that the characters maintain, on the brink of collapse is seems to be illusory by a degree, meaning that, of course, there is no room in matter just per se for some spiritual forces within them, unless we, as fallen kind, are able somehow to transfer it to them, right? If anything, you don't understand whether this is an illusion, literally meaning that it's just you seeing this happening, because the book doesn't really tell you. And so if, as tradition really says, matter is just an illusion per se, because at least it does exist, but it's as such just a consequence of the cracking of the sky vault after the fall, and so it's a consequence of our own fall, and the fact that the universe is broken and it's falling apart for the second principle of thermodynamics, and that we would be the only ones who could put back the thing together, but are basically incapable, and so on. So we saw that the world simply disintegrating on the basis of our own sin and our own incapacity to fix the wall, right? There is also an impending sense of death in this all that at least I think is more realistic. Looking at this world, especially the new town, where there are corpses, there is poverty, there is squalor, there is really an ugly face, the one in fact of the lower masses that are loathed in fact by the protagonists, where, as we've seen, the ones who should be defending as aristocrats, the mores, the order of the world, etc. And the sense of that, however, is evidently impending on everyone, right? Everyone seems to be fearful, fixated with something, trying to distract him or herself from carrying out a broader effort for fixing the situation. Again, you are in charge. This is what tradition says. You can be more in charge than others, but this doesn't mean that you're actually going to be able to gap the distance between you and God in this way, and in the measure in which it doesn't happen, the thing just doesn't remain like it is, but actually you're aging, you're dying, you're decomposing already, right? So this sense of moral putrescence fundamentally emerges from the entire book. There is no true hero here, even, and this is very meaningful. The ones that there are better placed, that seem to have the greatest spark, that are the young people, are the ones that fail the worst in the end, which is also very, very biblical in many ways, because it shows how a bit like Lucifer, that he was really the most gifted of all the angelic ranks, and yet he's exactly the one that, by trying to achieve, as we will see now, literally the world domination, falls, right, is punished, and is properly becomes the symbol of the worst evil, right? In this sense, it's really it's all really beautiful. For Tzadlo, again, we will talk about it later. This is a let's say a being, right? A symbol. This is again a human being, apparently almost devoid of personality of his own, because he basically embodies. Nobody understands whether under external influence or his own will, different people, and acting as them from time to time in the story. What is fascinating of this character is indeed the fact that he can literally change, appear. He's an actor, right? He's a derelict. He lives, as we'll see now, together with a gypsy woman in downtown, and performs occasionally. We don't know much about him in this taverns, etc., as an actor, etc. We don't know much about him, but all the time he interacts with the protagonists of the story. He is able to assume the same semblances of people that were either known to the characters or even themselves at that given moment. And he has a quite even in his character, there is a lot about that. First of all, he basically looks like a corpse at some point at the beginning. Everything seems like a quid pro quo, right? He is just arriving apparently drunk in the castle. He's taken in the aristocratic apartment. Then this guy is of course is a problem, but one of the aristocrats seems to resemble his deceased brother in him, and then he's brought. The gypsy arrives and she takes him away because they live together, by the way, and more of Lisa the Bohemian later. Another time in a tavern, he literally kills a man, but only through the image of death that he is able to embody, and that just the person who dies is able to see. I mean, it's as if, again, it weren't much the power of this Frizzatolo and or whoever is meant to represent, including the devil, because that's what emerges at some point during the story, apparently. Or whether it's the person, rather, because that's what the meaning seems to be, that wants to see in him something, right? That Frizzatolo becomes just at that point the image of, and a bit like the voice of truth. He's really weird because he doesn't do anything. He's present in various scenes, but in all of these he's not practically doing anything on his own, right, as a character on his own. It's as if he were just a mirror, an empty reflection of something else that is seen, recognized by the characters, and so on, right? And he is indeed the mirror of this entire thing. I mean, looking through him, you can look at different dimensions that you thought were lost, but are living within yourself, and are thus reflected in the Sratlo. Now, for Meyrink, this would in effect be the extreme limit of a state, which, however, is contained. It basically reaches the same limits of human life proper, right? Or at least in the case of Sratlo specifically, we don't know whether it gets to the extremes, but there are some scenes in which he also speaks in this sort of trance while he is just mutating image. That seems to be speaking of an absolute. He seems to be speaking of the actualization of the self, but he seems to be doing it, and that's the most enigmatic part of the novel, by alluding to essentially to just the mere satisfaction of your wishes and desires, and especially the a self-actualization achievable through joy, right? So a total state of perfection and satisfaction, evidently. And he goes as far as saying, as also tradition does, that the ultimate end of that is becoming God yourself, right? Which sounds a bit border limit orthodox, but actually in tradition is correct, because the entire point of humanity is going back to the one. So inverting the fall and and managing to get in tune with universal harmony to repristinate, to invert the trend, to go back to eternal youth, the golden age, and this is only possible through not delegating to an external, abstraction that falls out of the self, your own existence, fundamentally. So. Here I should open a great digression on how that is reconcilable with God, because it has to do with grace, and it has to do exactly with the actualization of the self in the moment in which the self manages to be wanting something, by getting enlightened by the experience and essentially eliminating all the influences that derive from this fallen world, and automatically coming back to the one as such, right? And according to tradition and religion proper, what we talk about God's grace, I made a video about that, it literally means that kind of coincidence. The fact that, yes, you should be coming back to the one, because it wouldn't be just about yourself. It's not that you can't simply be God in the form of, again, I save myself, I become God, and so good luck everybody else. No, that means literally that the entire humanity at that point reverts to that process, the entire creation, and so on. And the reason why I think that Meyrink gets it right is that there is a passage we'll talk about now about literally the goal of world restoration through being the emperor of the world, right? Which, especially paradoxically, even the socialists are trying to do in the story, and failing miserably, of course, because they are the worst. To get even any close to it in the first place. But in this sense, it also shows unequivocally what Meyrink's idea of, let's say, also what that aristocratic sclerotism was really about, that they were, of course, aware of what the higher meaning is, and what that is, that what we would be supposed as mankind to be doing in order to fix the things, and yet we, by knowing it, because this is the greatest fault, we don't act upon it, right? We just say, okay, but I'm limited by myself, fundamentally, by matter. Well, what does it mean? Well, the doctrine of the awakening is, and tradition entirely, is exclusively about this point. And so this is also why for Christianity it took the Son of God and the Son of Man at the same time to get sacrificed, to show again humanity how far God's power can go in order to offer the possibility of transfiguration. So this world that the aristocrats are defending is definitely the one of God. I say this because in the episode with Verzadlo, in which he basically talks about this pure joy and full accomplishment, he does, if I'm not wrong, refer to God as if it was just an excuse for, at least, however, and this is what I think Meyrink really meant, in the way people use the idea of God, not the fact that there is not such thing like one. In fact, he actually encourages to reach the one once again. And that's the only moment in which Verzadlo does something apparently noble. He is kind of a mocking, hateful character where you don't really like him. It's more like a living dead or something, and so he's quite unsettling. But he reproaches Flugbile. We'll talk about him today as Flugbile, essentially the doctor of the ancient Habsburgic imperial court, for not doing that. In that case, specifically after that guy died in the tavern, this Flugbile that was essentially the only one that awakens, apparently, but still we'll talk about it in the end, because it was also the only one who had the courage to go downtown, so exposing himself to the Dionysian and having this potential in kind of conjugating the Apollonian dominance that he embodies socially, politically, with the lower elements, emotion, strength, let's say, there's also this Dionysian dimension of the tavern, of the drinking and so on, really could be sensitive to, right? And on that occasion, Verzadlo basically acquires, takes on the same Flugbile's expression, because, well, the guy who had watched his funeral face died of a heart attack. Basically, all the tavern gets deserted, and the only they two remain in it. And there is this very long monologue of Verzadlo that Flugbile listens to and realizes that by looking at his young self in the mirror, he must be doing something about, and that the actual meaning of life is about that kind of coming back to the one, right? And really following the joy of this all, because the sense of this whole novel seems to be expressing kind of a pity towards people, right? Again, all the characters that you see in the novel are miserable people in a way or another, right? There is really no hero. There are just these few people that get closer to the deal, but fundamentally do not make it in time. Understand the thing, but never fully to the degree that would be needed to really make it, right? So there is really much in the way Meyrink expresses this sort of occult awareness, right? While Flugbeius told this, there is not like a rationalization of the world. He keeps on living, trying to do the same things, also in order to soothe himself. He has strange nightmares. He also dreams of the devil, and that's the sign towards his death, that things actually took, in my opinion, a different turn, and that's the reason why he fails really in the end, but more of that later. Meyrink in this work speaks of an initiatory doctrine, fundamentally, the one of the awakening, according to which existence down here is nothing but a long night strewn with mirages and nightmares, which is the Walpurgisnacht, right? So the idea that we are in the Platonic myth of the cave and so on. And so an experience through which we must necessarily go through, because really there is literally no other way to save ourselves but to pain and horror, in order to give rise, in some at least, by a degree of the awakening, right? And this, telling the truth, and I also think this is what the book is about the torturer's awareness of the fact that we cannot fully achieve it, right? Most the characters are two kinds. One that is they just do what they have to do. They don't even think about the world problem anymore. In part, they are not analyzed to the point in which you understand really what they are thinking. So they're not presented just as caricatures. And there is especially the figure of the Countess that is a bit the key for interpreting the novel in the end, I will say. And then another one that seems to be at least aware all of a sudden of this necessity of awakening, of kind of shaking from yourself off all this laziness and weakness and fear and anxiety and whatever, and simply going for whatever you want, right? A sort of will to power, but really something that should be substantiated in reality with a limitless capacity. Would be the one ultimately of transfiguration, and that's where things do not really occur. So you don't really find in this book like a thoughtless youth that just enjoys everything, or somebody is happy. No, everybody is rigged. You can't feel the weight, the burden of sin, of the fall in all of these characters, and how this is essentially consuming them, is wearing them down, is making them age, is making them die, right? And this is why this is beautiful, because it's as if you have after all, luminous. There are some scenes also in at night and dark, but generally speaking, this Prague is a real Prague. It's not a fake one. It's a lively world. There is light, etc. But you realize that underneath all of this, there is like an enormous tragedy of the world. It's a bit like Waiting for Godot, the sense of, we are causing this as mankind. That is, the world to keep on falling without doing nothing about it for real. So there is also in this doctrine of the awakening presented by Meyrink, the realization of course, the existence of the light, not achieving the truth, because otherwise it would be literally that, right? It would change everything instantly. But at least there is a sign of light, of day, which scatters the ghosts. And this is also why the title of this novel is Walpurgisnacht, because it, the idea is that in this kind of hellish, earthly experience, we are to go through, but ultimately there should be a moment of awakening before, the night actually doesn't stop and swallows everything. This is a bit the entire concept of also the astronomic cycles of the solstice, and so on, and that all humanity has been reflecting on, given exactly this limits of human potential. So, getting to the characters, there are two destinies considered in the novel. One we have already acquainted, that of Tadeusz Flugbile. This is again an esteemed doctor. He frequents the aristocrats. He goes playing cards with them. He is familiar with them. He is literally he has his parade livery. He really works in the Habsburg court. He has quite of a high tone of life. He goes to the baths during the good season. He has like his coach, his servant, and so on. And he lives in the Vrezzani, right, from the good side. But sometimes he crosses the Moldavan into the downtown, right, with great shock of the aristocrats, by the way, that say, "Oh my God, did you do that? I would never go there." There is some aristocratic characters that never set foot in downtown Prague, because that's hell. It's mixing with the scum of the earth, right? And as we'll see, Flugbile's story is intertwined with Lisa the Bohemian. That I'm not entirely sure, but I think she is a gypsy, as a matter of fact. In any case, this was at least in her younger days a beautiful prostitute who now looks dramatically pitiful, right? And basically all the men from the Rezzani had known her because, of obvious reasons, in their youth, including Flugbile. Right, and it turns out throughout the story, initially she's presented as just as a disgusting-looking, old, miserable lady, right? That you could see, once having been beautiful, really good-looking, but now really looking very miserable, without teeth, with filthy clothes, all this stuff. It really disgusts you, like Meyrink. Talking also about the aristocrats, tells you this kind of, morally crippled, visited, fearful individuals. And not that anyone, again, in the story is better, but it really, transmits you the sense of disgust, right? Including because Flugbile, that is somehow younger than, he's like, I think the story doesn't really say, right, how old they are, but she's old, and he is younger than her, so he is a middle-aged, if not towards, properly an elderly himself, almost. In any case, it turns out throughout the story that that at least she had loved him, right? That when they were younger and they had a relationship, she really loved him. And this is maybe it's not so important in the story, but it's something underlying a bit the all the things she does, because it's revealed only in the end. But you can understand that she's a bit more of a child, like she's a bit more emotional. She's not really. Flugbile is a bit of man with, like, this person who seems like a bit rational and sane and with a backbone in the whole story, or at least to have had still some trace of that somewhere as a respectable man. And so he initially is disgusted himself by this gypsy that I don't remember in the story after how much time he meets again. They knew her there, but she appears as a sort of ghost when he looks with the lenses into Old Town, and he looks pretty terrible things, and he thinks that there is something devilish about her in the way it seems as if she had spotted him looking at her such a great distance. So there is something unsettling about it, but he is attracted to her for some reason, right? He doesn't seem to be aroused. Of course, it's not a sexual thing, but he seems to be missing those days, right? He seems to be thinking at the fact that, now he's older, and what sense is there in everything, right? He tries again to suit himself with his routine, with this fact he would go to Carlsbad to, leading this pretty stern existence, but there are pretty miserable, instances that really tell you how, bit of an anti-hero he really is, right? For example, there is a scene in which he writes on an agenda, in a sort of diary, in which he remembered how everything he had done in his entire life, and he counts the frequency of a sexual encounter in like once in, I don't know, 400 days on average, and including that most of that would have been because of Lisa the Bohemian. There is another scene which it turns out that once, when he was alone at Christmas, he had both a pair of slippers with a forget-me-not flower on it, to think that could fill the void, and he has a sort of an artificial sensation that somebody was missing it. And what is fascinating is considering the fact that Lisa did actually love him all throughout that time, because he visits her at a point and she says it's just so miserable. He wanted to help her because he was rich and she was so now desperate, and she cried thinking over the memories with him and all this. So it's all terrifying in a way, morally. It turns out that she lives with Frzzadlo, who turns out in the end she was having a relationship with, because she thought he was the devil, and she had made a pact with him to take on Flugbeil's appearance, and basically making her relieve the days of love, the good days, right, that Flugbeil and her had spent together, right? So this tells you the misery of it all. It even makes you think of who the hell Frzzadlo really is, right? But the question is that this is not to be answered. Like, answering who Frzzadlo is in the novel is like answering, like, what the hell are we doing here in the first place as humans? This story we'll talk more about in the end, because it begins in such a miserable way, but it makes you move in the end, basically more than any other, and it's all dramatic in the end. The other destiny considered is the one of Polissena and Ottokar. Now, Polissena is the nephew of the countess of one of these aristocrats, and she is basically the boss of the household that also Flugbeil frequents. So Polissena is also, the name is quite evocative, because, as you know, in the mythology, she is a sort of, at least she became in the Hellenic tragedies, a sort of an equivalent of Agamemnon's daughter, right? She is a sort of a very noble and very beautiful woman that, however, is to be taken away by destiny. Actually, she's the only one who doesn't die. She's like a young woman, actually a girl. And Ottokar instead is just, I don't even remember what he does, but he's a commoner who plays, he's another boy, he is, I think, 19, something like that, and he comes to play the violin for the countess at the palace. And basically, we don't know much about the relation between the two, but they basically fall in love with each other. And these two characters are, especially Polissena, I think are very interesting, because, first of all, starting with Ottokar, there is a symbolism here, even in the Bohemian history, because Ottokar it will be clearer later, is named undoubtedly after Ottokar II Przemysl, right? He basically embodies from one side, the stereotype as it's emerged from medieval historiography of the quasi-pagan king who wanted too much, too many riches, and gets destroyed and broke down and despoiled of all power. Right, I still have to make a video about him because he's one of the most fascinating rulers of the Middle Ages, and I wrote a master thesis about him, or at least the Battle of Markfeld where he died. So Ottokar there is a typical, it's surely a reference to him. And so also to the grandeur of the Bohemians, properly of the ethnic race, because Ottokar represents the commoners, represents the fourth estate, right? He is also adopted, he's poor, and by the way, he's faulty from a physical point of view. He has some heart condition for which he's meant to die young, some sort. But we're not told whether he's an exceptional violinist, but he definitely plays well because he has sort of spiritual experience while he plays, so much so these forces of the world seem to be flowing through him in the violin and the music he plays, and everything is so natural for him. So that the Countess accepts him, even though she is very cold with him in general, and there is of course a distance between the two because of the social divisions. And there is another aspect of this that connects him with Polissena, but the thing is much clearer about her, because she is first of all very beautiful. She's like at least until the end, she is your favorite character, right? Because she seems like a bit the hero of the situation. She's beautiful, she's intelligent, she's courageous. By the way, she is truly conservative. She has this high sense of herself, of her nobility, but you immediately understand that by falling in love with this kid, there is something wrong. There is sort of curse on her. And Polissena has a very special connection with a portrait of an ancestor of hers, a noble woman, died, centuries before or right around there, that camps among the other portraits in the Countess hall. I don't remember exactly, where also Ottokar played the violin. And the interesting thing that Meyrink does about this is that he basically resumes the ancient idea of the fact that the images, think about the Imago Imperatorius, or the various chthonic cults of the Mani, of these gods of the blood, of flesh, right? Of chthonic creatures that, however, basically live on in the blood of the earth, the blood of the world, and make us up in our flesh and bones, and that are animated because they have, say, as we are part of them, basically, or they are part of us, wherever you want to see it, like, have the capacity to fight, to transfigure, because they have the spark of life. And these images are important because basically all the other portraits are dead, whereas this ancestress of Polissena seems to be quite alive. When she looks at her, Polissena sees this force, these eyes it's her, like they look alike, by the way. And so it turns out that there is a connection also with Ottokar's ancestry. I don't remember exactly how. But the story goes in the novel, however, is that Ottokar, because there was a voice around in Prague that he was the bastard son of the Countess, right? So this would have basically connected Polissena and Ottokar's blood, fundamentally in a sort of incest, right? Because that's also what the curse really is, that she's the most beautiful character, the most she has this great sense of herself. She embodies tradition. She loathes the socialists. She wants to fight against them. She wants them dead, right? She's a true hero. But she eventually succumbs to them, exactly to them. And so this shows the thing I was saying before about Lucifer, that is to say, that even though the most blessed is in fact so with an advantage, that being the favorite, the one that can achieve the thing, this is also the one that has the greatest burden, and very often as an unspoiled individual like Polissena is at the beginning, also the one that has still yet to go under the trial and being tested and having the quickest way to the fall than the others who manage, maybe like Flugbile, to have had their career and everything, but still remaining sclerotized and having basically passed their prime and not being able to revert to the beginnings anymore. So this is fascinating because you see Ottokar is flawed. He has to die at some point, not in the, say, necessarily in he has to die in general, because he actually dies in the end, as we will see, and not of his heart condition, whereas Polissena is like perfect. She's the typical Apollonian, you can't say hero, because technically according to tradition there can't be a woman who is a hero, for reasons that I can't explain, because she embodies fundamentally the chthonic dimension. So at least she should be tamed and dominated, and she ends to be tamed and possessed and dominated by the lowest scum. So this is a terrifying thing, plus in an incest plot, plus becoming, as we will see now, like probably the leader almost, or if not, this is the point, she's actually taken over by forces that are greater than her, even though she was so close to be able to tame them, to dominate them. So this is a beautiful metaphor, in my opinion. In any case, this is the point. You can see here always the dualism. Ottokar and Polissena love each other, but there are forces that are greater than them, that unavoidably pass through them like a great spirit of history, and that they are not able to handle, and so they unavoidably fall. This is a great metaphor for lots of relationships in general, and what really love is supposed to be, being able to maintain the hold, right, and being unshattered, even in the most unshattering of emotional statuses, like falling in love really is. There is more, though. It's not really a love story to Kur, nor Flugbiles and Lisa's one really is, right? But this element, say, love as a form of completion, right, and of course the unification of the male and the female principle, and the possession from the side of the first and the submission of the other is crucial for transfiguration. Well, this is also about the collectivity, about the collective sin in the world, and so what happens in it, and not merely to abstracted individuals. And this is a very powerful memento of human condition as such. Now, one can argue that Flugbile's story is the only one to actually end in the awakening, right? Because at the end of his great life spent in the dead and conventional world, in the ancient Prague aristocracy, he comes to feel the vanity of his own wall existence, right? He comes to feel that he has betrayed his own soul. Flugbile, I think, is the most relatable character of the world novel, because it really fits, at least in my opinion, lots of characteristics that I seem to have myself. I mean, I've had a life, I've had relationships, I've had, I've seen the world out there, and I've also achieved something here, and I go on planning this. But in this sense, it's as if I had also normalized all this in a way. Okay, it's going fairly good. I don't have to think about anything else. You can feel that sort of vanity. You can feel that sort of, I am able to do this, and whatever, with my work and all, but is this literally just what I'm supposed to do, right? This is what I think also most conservatives today think like. There is a sort of, manual of instructions for living, kind of upper middle class life, and then you die at some point and it's there, right? If you succeeded in having a family, children, whatever, having done something, having helped someone, having created something, it's fine. You can die happily. This counts, and there is no wonder about this. I mean, there is no such trace of tradition nowadays, not even in conservatism. The entire point of the salvation of mankind, which is a thing that definitely doesn't work by living such kind of life. So, Flugbile understands this in a way that is, that is developed naturally throughout all the story, right? There's a confused nostalgia, basically, for a new youth that serves him as a way. That is his main point. That is also very relatable. That is to say, everything would be fine as long as we remained young. We just became increasingly intelligent, but we were, if not immortal, at least we wouldn't age so ruinously in many ways. He really feels that, and so that's also very relatable. And he has a gradual awakening, at least, as I was saying before. He seems to be aware of the situation, but he also is not, and this is the entire point, he's not able to properly to admit it to himself to the fullest. Right? So there is a crescendo that includes also a nightmare in which the devil presents to him in a truly satanistic fashion, which has apparently maybe nothing in fact to do with the entire meaning of this book, or at least may symbolize the craze that Flugbile had once for his, more than else, his sexual adventures, and or the idea of really, because he enjoys life, he enjoys travels, he enjoys good meals, he has a tone for himself, so it's mostly the vanity of that. And when he dreams of the devil, just, if I'm not wrong, exactly the day before his death, which comes in a relatively unexpected way as a part of the awakening, basically the devil presents him falsely as just the only god that cares about humans, because he is there to satisfy their immediate pleasures. This doesn't have to do with Versadlo's speech in the tavern. This seems to be more like a sensual presence in his life that seems to actually bend him down to something less honorable and sensible than what the same Flugbile really wanted. Right? He's definitely not a devil worshipper, nor he likes very much to make such dreams. But it seems to be pressing him, right? And generally speaking, all the world around him starts falling apart, because basically the book ends the day in which the socialists make a revolt that we will see now, that once that goes attacking Prague Old Town, and so comes to basically wanted to kill all the aristocrats. There are voices that the revolutionaries have mined all the castle. It wants to make it blow up. So basically there is this moment of agitation that Flugbile, that is so absorbed now but is awakening, wants to dismiss, saying, the soldiers will arrive now, that there is, this scum of, revolutionary scum is not actually to do anything. And what turns out is that he is convinced at that point, because this tension mounts during the day. He's worried himself because he hears mess outside of his apartment. He thinks that there is something going wrong in Prague, and Lisa arrives to him. And normally she felt ashamed about herself regarding herself, showing herself in company of Flugbile, because Flugbile was the doctor of the court. he was such a great person, and she was just an old miserable prostitute. And instead, in that moment, Flugbile realizes, because she had come to warn him that the revolutionaries were arriving and that he had to go, he had to flee, that basically they had always, she had always loved him. And so all the fears that he had had about not being alone, not being, of being alone, of not being loved, of not having anybody caring, not having married, by the way, not having had children, not having had anyone next to him. It's a sort of selfish realization, right? That's why it ends bad, in my opinion. That he wish I had a dog, right? That Lisa arrives, and in her almost childish, form of expression, basically tells him all the story of her sad love, the fact that she had thought of Flugbile all her life, that she loved him still. And this revelation strikes Flugbile, who basically, even at this point of awakening, is not really fully sure what is going to happen. He accepts Lisa there. It's a miserable scene, telling the truth, because he's half undressed in a very unheroic way, because he had been in bed up to that time. And he starts, that's the point, he starts, instead of being overjoyed by this, that's where Zadlo's speech at the beginning was very meaningful. He basically is very struck by this, very moved, but he decides that he will not care anymore about conventions, that he will go live with Lisa somewhere outside Prague for the rest of their lives, like a couple, fundamentally. And Lisa flees in this moment. Initially, we don't know why. He basically starts just dressing himself up, preparing the coach, telling his servant to be able to move, because he realized that the revolt there was true, right, and there was some risk, but he didn't care to die already at that point. In theory, there is no transfiguration in him, right? There is the end of Walpurgisnacht for him in the moment of death himself, practically, because the story is dramatic. He goes out in the yard, in the hall of this apartment in the old town, this palace in the old town, and he realizes, because he wanted to get away and to reach Lisa in some way, but he's so crazy that, he's so at that point confused of this whole thing that is happening within him, that he simply comes in the yard to see that Lisa has been killed. Because she had gone trying to stop the revolutionaries and preventing them from coming to kill him, because she loved him, and she dies, at least a hero, we can say, being hit in the head to death. In fact, just trying to, with a purpose of loving him. This is powerful, and at that point nobody really understands what passes in Flugbile's mind, because he tells his servant to prepare the coach to go somewhere out of Prague during the revolt that is being partly contained, as we will see now. And he goes out. At some point the coach breaks the axle. It stops. Flugbile goes out, and he says, I have to keep going on. Basically, this awakening of his in the necessity of always going forward in a kind of ecstasy, right? Going towards death herself, right, out of Prague. He starts running. The servant says, wait, master, where are you going? He actually starts walking along the tracks of the train, which he, by the way, detested, because as an aristocrat, he loathed trains and everything to do with that. He had written in his testament that in case of his death, he should have never been carried anywhere by train, to be buried. And he actually just accepts his fate by a degree that he voluntarily gets into, and he's smashed by the train. It was, by the way, carrying the Bosnian troops to Prague to suppress the revolt. And so this is the terrifying end of Flugbile, which people said, oh my god, this guy saw it all, understood it, everything. No, he dies like a moron, basically. Even if he had wanted that or whatever, it's not dying the point of it all. It didn't solve anything, right? The obvious meaning of this is he failed anyway. That everything began to when everything began to fall apart, when the hour of the wolf came, he couldn't prevent anything, right? Including saving the woman who, because he probably wouldn't even love her, right? He lived of memories of love or things like that. But there is no real awakening within him, or at least it was not enough, right, naturally, to achieve transfiguration. Of course, not even Lisa could do that. I mean, we have to be concrete about the fact that, again, nobody can save him or herself by the fact themselves. What is at least perceivable, however, in Flugbile's awakening is the following. That is to say, the youth that his soul yearned for at the end of his life appears to him as the eternal youth that is not of this conditioned world. He manages to literally kill himself in an incredible act of bravery, after all, even though you see no rational point in it, unless he had been so devastated from Lisa's death and the entire realization that his life was wasted anyway. So it is really a suicide, right? And it doesn't look good at all, right? Speaking of Otakar and Polissena, the situation here is very different, and by a degree it's more twisted even, but there is a point in the end that I think is quite meaningful. So as we've seen, these guys had been brought together by fatal and ancestral influences. And Polissena was by far the strongest. I mean, she had a... Otakar doesn't appear by any degree like any strong soul, right? He's just a sickly, fearful kid who is frightened by the Countess' judgment while he plays the violin for her, and he is just... overwhelmed by Polissena's beauty, who instead has much more of a temper and an idea. Nobody really understands whether Otakar actually loves her. What is clear to me is Polissena is a bit like Flugbile. She doesn't quite love Otakar. There is something, as we will see now, almost superstitious and magic and dark and Dionysian about this connection with Otakar. It's a connection of the blood, but it doesn't quite lead anywhere. It's not a pure idea, it's not a pure thought, so you can immediately see Polissena's dark side. Even though she's very, again, well-principled, she's also, say, hypocritical. At least she ends up exactly with the scum of the earth, and she even gets pregnant with him. This thing happens, however, after another crescendo that had, in fact, that symbolizes the Walpurgisnacht, perhaps best than any other in the novel, because I think it actually does take place exactly in the night between April the 30th and May the 1st. In Prague at night at the Tower of Hunger, because there is a secret socialist meeting that Polissena goes to spy secretly from a hole in the pavement, I think, of this old building. And in this meeting, Otakar participates. Right, we don't know much about Otakar's political ideas before this. We don't really see the world of the commoners. Just Meyrink makes you understand that, of course, your background determines more or less what you are. Ottokar, as we've seen, is weak, so he's simply going to be a socialist. Maybe even if he doesn't understand much of that, or even cares about, but he's carried away by some other force that doesn't come from within him. Polissena instead is hyper powerful because she's strengthened by the force of her ancestors in the portrait that makes her alive in the blood of her own ancestors, in fact, of her own clan, in a trans-temporal way. And she basically engages in a spiritual struggle during the this socialist meeting. We will see in a while. Basically, there is a scene before like this one in which the nobility of Prague once a year, like the Romans, like Semen in anno licet insanire, basically had a dinner with the servants, and so they could call each other without any courtesy form. And there are all these servants, and the tradition in her house was that it was the youngest female, I think, of the house that had to stay at the table with all the servants. And Polissena meets with these servants, including a Tartar from Russia who was speaking of the Avaisha. We will see now that is this theory that Meyrink brings on the fore, that is a sort of black voodoo Haitian kind of ritual for which, not necessarily with the sticks and all, but is a sort of power attributed to shamans and fakir magicians, essentially of abandoning one's own body to take possession of that of another, right, in order to manifest an act in it. And the starter servant eventually is, together with Ottokar and Frezadlo and others, mostly workers that we don't know further at the meeting. And the Walpurgisnacht here is definitely the moment of the struggle between, again, the forces of good that are represented by Polissena and the forces of evil that basically are expressed, are summoned by through Frezadlo during the meeting, in which he makes another speech similar to the one of the tavern, basically insulting the socialists, saying, you're good for nothing, you don't even know what you want. But basically, also through the Tartar and this kind of force that Polissena senses through this ancestress and the power that she had given to her, summons in fact the spirit of Yanciska, the head of the Hussites. So this spirit manifests itself, and when this happens, Polissena gets overwhelmed and gets possessed by this spirit, by this incredibly violent and bloody, with the entire power of the rebellious Hussites, right, that here are symbolized naturally by the socialist masses, right, the revolt of the lowest classes of the multitude. And this is basically the Walpurgisnacht, because it lasts until the following day. There is all this myth, let's say, also again in the Czech folklore, that there is a permanence here, that the girl must be kissed that night, and then for the following day, I don't remember exactly the details, but there is a marriage going on that literally takes place during the revolt of Prague, in which Polissena and Ottokar are crowned emperors of the world, right? The idea is that this is very interesting, because it focuses beautifully on the traditional vision that there cannot be any power in the world that is not properly playing by the same rules of power in the world, like anarchism, socialism, whatever, this idea that there shouldn't be any leader actually ends up in having some of the most brutal, ferocious, stupid, and incompetent leaders of all. And the sad thing is that Polissena not just is overwhelmed by this force, and basically she lives in a sort of trance throughout all this thing. She's literally possessed, right? She also has sex with Ottokar. She remains pregnant, by the way, which is quite meaningful there. So the incest, the scene has consumed itself. So there is a dramatic curse now on the both of them, and you can easily understand where it gets down. But she's not overwhelmed just by the spirit of Shishka and of the revolt of the Hussites that she had read vaguely because of when she was a kid from some secret book of the enormous violences, the burning of the Adamites, the fact that Shishka had, also made a skin out of. He had wanted actually to when he died to be skinned and to be used as a drum, in fact, to still lead the army, right? And this thing is actually done by Fersadlo. Fersadlo basically becomes the medium of all this, becomes a bit the even though during even the meeting he is completely like dumb, stupid. Every once in a while he's possessed himself by this force that speaks incredible sense, and basically evokes Shishka himself, and she got scared, she gets caught by them. But the interesting thing again is that all the power that she had got from her ancestors reemerges, comes back to life, greedy for love and blood, right? Like a vampire. Meaning what? Meaning that spirit that lived in the portrait naturally is the one of the chthonic element of the race, right? It's the one that literally needs blood to sustain itself. That's the entire point why in all traditional cultures there were these gods. Is the same reason why, I don't know, in some areas of Eastern Europe people still eat during funerals and leave the food next to the grave. That you can see also in Roman cemeteries. You can see there's literally some cannulae which they poured wine and other stuff in the tomb, in the grave. This was present all over the world, and it's present in the memory of all these chthonic forces that also Walpurgisnacht represents, inasmuch as it was again believed that the possibility of transfiguring, of course derived doctrinally, as it's true also in Catholicism against the heretics, the Cathars, etc., from soul and body, right? Thinking that the soul is separated from the body, like as this crazy fanatics, with speaking nonsense about transgenderism and all this stuff, is pure Gnosticism. It doesn't make any sense. You are all one with body and flesh because you have produced that, right? So it's not by trying to bail out of your body that anything changes. Actually, you're ever weaker and damned and incapable, right? At least the Dionysian even tells you to use the body to some degree, and it can be the start for trying to tame that and to transfigure further, right? So here, what happens to Polissena is quite meaningful, inasmuch you see how dangerous the chthonic forces really are, how much of a moral virtue and a spiritual superiority it takes to beat the forces of the darkness and to be worth of salvation at the end of the day. Jan Žižka's spirit here, we don't understand whether he was summoned or not. We don't understand whether this is all a farce. It's wholly a farce, and people just evoke these forces within themselves because they are too weak to actually be imperturbable and simply doing what they have to do. and more of that later with the Countess. The consequence is that Ottokar and Polissena are married. They actually have to be crowned by going to the old castle where it was said that the Countess had a beautiful crown with a ribbon, etc., so that Ottokar could be the emperor of the world, because it was still believed in this kind of superstitious Bohemian masses that, of course, the world was essentially the 14th century Bohemian, so the Holy Roman Emperors, the Luxembourgs, were all about, if you ruled over Prague, you would rule the world in 1917, right? So they're completely deluded and dumb and completely demented. Like, if you read the story, they're completely out of their minds. The important, though, is that the masses, the individuals, of course, are completely worthless. There is no trace of any human consistency in socialism, but the masses as a whole, so this dumb giant titan that is led by Shishka, pass through the mass, right? Basically, Ottokar and Polissena, and especially here, Polissena is the one who rules. Like, Ottokar seems still pretty incapable, right? He had some sort of awakening at some point in the story while he was going to the Countess. He wanted to ride on a horse and taking over the world. There was something about him, about his blood, that was surely the one related with the Countess, of which, remember, he was probably the bastard of, and voices circulated around. And this was the damnation, that he wanted to be a hero and he couldn't because he was just sick and unfit and whatever. And what at the center of this kind of revolution, right, that there is and all the fascination, the vortex, this mass that ends up acting collectively, galvanized in revolt, is indeed led by Shishka, so the tragic figure of the Hussite movement, but let's say is headed still by the couple, and Polissena is the one who is carried away by it, but is also kind of guiding it. And there is the chthonic female principle, who basically symbolizes, of course, the socialist degeneration, and that is naturally doomed to fail, but to fail badly. The only problem, though, is that Polissena is at least minimally, at least even though she's possessed, she's given way to this force, she's still at least bound, as we've seen, by blood to her house. She's still a noble woman. She's still someone who doesn't quite end like all this other scum. In fact, the most satisfying scene, and the one that is mostly makes most sense in all this, is that when the revolutionaries entered the castle, right? They enter they arrive at the palace of the Countess and ask for the crown, because it was rumored that this Countess had lots of an enormous treasure, right, hidden in the castle. And so these were the terrible masters that had oppressed the working class and all these things, and they wanted, however, this is the subtlety of it, that the working class wants the imperial crown, right? That perfectly embodies the complete stupidity, ignorance, and cultural underdevelopment of the masses. The idea that they, even when they want to tear down the system, the only way they have to have any power is to still mimic the system. The same reason why totalitarianism rises to power and fails, of course, miserably. And the thing here is that Ottokar asks for the crown, and I think calls the Countess his mother, says "Mom," or thing like that, and the Countess is at the balcony of the palace, takes this pistol from centuries-old pistol, ridiculously loaded, but still well enough. And the Countess says, "Die, bastard," and he shoots his son right in the head and blows up his brains. And in the same time, the guards, the Austro-Hungarian army has arrived, and they begin to fire on the crowd, and of course lots of people die. And all this, Polissena basically doesn't give a fuck. She looks at Ottokar, that towards whom evidently she didn't feel anything, because he was so low that there was just a sort of curse on them to be intertwined in this incest and nothing else. She notices that the shot in his forehead looks like a ribbon, like a crown. After all, that's the only crown that the rebel scum deserves. And while the soldiers are shooting with rifles and machine guns over the crowd, slaughtering in great numbers, she basically just flies kindly among them, and they see she's a noble woman of some sort, and she passes through them simply. And she gets out of there, and basically all the Walpurgisnacht for her is also over. Dissolves and leaves behind only the ashes, right? The Razzani, with the death of Ottokar, king of the world, and all this lunacy, right? The people, they are literally hallucinated in the sign of Shishka. And Polissena decides basically that she's done for. Basically, after all this, having unleashed the forces of blood, voluptuousness, death, with this brief mirage of an illusory splendor that literally the socialists had managed to do, because they had started the revolt, they had married the two guys, they had carried them in a parade as if they were literally the emperors of the world. Well, in this pale epilogue, Polissena is left alone. She's almost a shadow of herself, because she's literally burnt out by this. She didn't carry this out with any discipline, with any wisdom. She has failed herself, and basically she decides to knock on the door of a convent, and basically her story ends there. Right, she's the only one who, at least of the main characters, that doesn't die. She survives the massacre, but basically she's done for. She's not just pregnant with a relative that is also a bastard of the Countess. That is the Countess. There is just nobody really tells you fully whether she was actually the mother of Ottokar. This was rumored, and it's likely true, because in the novel it would make sense as far as the blood connection, the image of the ancestors, the fact that Ottokar had something theirs, surely is sparking from some trace of nobility. But the Countess is a secondary character, definitely, but she embodies, together with this crystalline clear reason, that she would shoot in the head her own son, just because these were a bunch of utterly disgusting rebels who wanted to kill everyone along the way. Think about Lisa being killed. Think about a lot of people that were, just despoiled, looted, killed, assassinated. So what the revolting mob does, all these aristocrats since the beginning of the book were horrified by the lesser people. She has the guts to stand in front of these revolutionaries from the balcony to shoot in the forehead their leader, who dies immediately, her own son. It is a beautiful picture. And then the slaughterhouse begins with the soldiers, and that is the only fate. This is the beauty of it. It's the only face that we really have of true power. It's the strongest power that we see. It's like a wall in all this novel of weakness, of delusion, of inconsistency. The only thing that actually works is hierarchy, is authority, is discipline, is order. the soldiers arrive and inflexibly massacre anyone. At the head there is there, symbolically of course, the Countess, who was able to coldly, rationally, and lucidly kill her own son in the process again. And that's the symbol of civilization. That's the symbol of reason in the form of the long path that civilization has to do in preserving tradition and making it a tower over the miseries, the disgusting reality, and the most putrescent elements of the world. This is beautiful, right? I think Meyrink there got it really, really right. You see, the Countess survives because she was the only one who had such solid moral principles to be able to sacrifice so much in the crystalline clear notion that the revolt, the rebels had to be killed because there is no other objective thing to do in a situation like that. Flugbile is weak. Actually, the Countess had gone to Flugbile before Lisa on the same morning to ask how to load this old antique, let's say, pistol, and she manages even to make to load that and to shoot it successfully and to even hit the guy in the head. That has a deep symbolism. It really means, it really reflects the determination of someone who knows what the values of civilizations are, whereas Flugbile doesn't even want to admit that there was a revolution. He says, I don't know, I will get my sword or my gun, I don't remember, if they try to come up here I will kill them, but he seemingly doesn't give a damn about that. He's too weak. He's too lost in his own individual problems to understand that in that moment he would have had just to go out there and facing the rebels and defending the castle. Right, that's the most important message there, that the Countess is the only one who really does the right thing, and who in fact is still not the hero that is able to save the world, but is still the one from which the side of force, of order, the Apollonian one, really lay, and that in fact stands successfully in a kind of heroic way against the entire mass by killing their dumb puppet leader, facing the same spirit of Shishka himself. What these noble Bohemians were criminally proud and aware of wanting to counter, because they knew what it had meant back in the 15th century. Right, the destruction of the world of good, fundamentally. So this work is really nice because Meyrink usually inserts in all his novels, in the form of short direct expositions, esoteric teachings which stand out almost like Claire gems set. Right, so when you look at Walpurgisnacht, you see it probably in some of the best ways. Right, a given moment, for example, in which Retzadlo, that is this kind of mediumistic receptacle of hearing influences, right, as a master of the Middle Kingdom, is embodied, and that expounds the doctrine through his mouth about truth herself. Well, there you have the essence, right? It's what the Veda conceived as the Atma, right? To which man is commonly external, although it constitutes his true center. Right? Is this idea that there is a force in the universe that you have to place yourself in the right relation with, so that you can fundamentally come to overlap it, and without which your own existence from a higher point of view is just the one of a shadow, as a bit like the one of all humans really is, including in this novel. Right, so the only ones who had the opportunity to shine at least the ones that had the closest, were Polyssena and Flugbile, and they both end miserably, actually in pretty miserable way. So all the speech by Satan, and also the same sense that you have just to pursue like material pleasures or whatever, is of course denied. And I would say that Sadlo's speech in the tavern is actually the opposite of that. It's represented by Meyrink in an ambiguously similar way, as to symbolize the subtlety existing in the difference between the two. That is to say, what is to actually actualize yourself, the self? Is it just do whatever you want, or is it realizing, right, why, right, this thing is the one that you want, and at that point, would it be the actual one that you want, or would that be something else? Like this is the entire point, after all, of the doctrine of the awakening, that is just an initiatory thing, where it's not about the just I do whatever I want to do. You have basically to regulate yourself, to test yourself, to go through gradual steps, and growing and maturing, and then having an ever clearer view of the world, right? Flugbile is the one that comes closer to it, in as much as at least reason, or at least a sort of distance from the excesses, seems to be involved. Polyssena is instead the symbol of that youthful impetus that, however, gets easily crashed because it still doesn't have a compass, right? Or it would have it, and it would be even probably the closest. Let's say it would be the most accurate one, the most unspoiled one to get there, but it's also, as we've seen, the most easily exposed, the one that can be a set of tracks more easily, right? So to go back to the Veda, such ego, practically such self, which also has an insensual form, and transfigures with joy. So what Sadlo was talking about in the tavern is the Ananda, right? That is basically the Vedic for designation, and is not tied nor to space nor time, which means, of course, in all those references in the book about, again, the blood running in the Moldova river, in the fact that the blood was soaked in it, there was this perpetually alive entity in the world that you still have just to draw in order to make it coming back to the one, is omnipresent. It goes beyond your personal existence, which is just say an illusion in the measure in which we just count it again, and we have this age, then we die, and whatever. It's not meant to be like that. This is incredibly static, ineffectual, and in fact just inconclusive condition that brings us simply to our end without leaving any trace, like all the ancestors in the gallery of Polysena's family, except the one of her, let's say, ancestral replica. And that's also the meaning fact of the fact that the ancestress was identical to her, is that that spirit does take the image of people, just like for Sadlo. But in a sense, it lives also in your blood. You're part of the world that has to come back to the one again. This is a perfectly clear anti-gnostic reality. There is no room in the world for anybody who thinks that the spirit has nothing to do with the flesh. Literally. So, for those who know how to put their center back in this kind of reason, in the truth, in the logos, in the verbum, call it where you want, basically all existential anguish all suffering and all guilt will disappear, because at that point the world would have been saved. And the fact again that we live in a time in which we have observed that nobody can do it by themselves anymore is the same reason again why we have Christianity, why the world fundamentally has stopped to this point, actually going under ever further, so with quite dramatic perspectives, right? But the idea is that if you become master of your own destiny, you will become the true living one, like the one who lives in an immanent sense, which is God himself, right? Every other thing just resembles a dull sun. You can have all these sparks of, this is what Meyrink says in the novel, the sparks of awakening of this little light that we see, but it's not going to be enough. Like, that's barely the beginning of something so big that we're not even able to fathom anymore in our world. Now there is a problem in the book, though, interpretatively speaking, because what appears clear is that extraneous demons playing the part of an illusory self in some of the characters. You eventually see it. You see Flugbile dreaming of the devil. You see Polissena basically again giving way to Shishka's demon as well. In a way, only he who hears the voice of the other, the true ego, right, as the entity who speaks through the mouth of Sadlo, knows liberation, and none of these characters fully get it. So even though there are some boundaries again to cross, and some characters here, the two characters, destroy the bonds that a kind of hypnosis has created for them along an indefinite series of generations, there is an idea, a specific idea of Meyrink, right, that goes beyond this Vedic teaching, right, of esoteric tradition, right. In the book you can perceive clearly this climate of obsession. As I was saying at the beginning, there is a very dark material, human in fact, degenerate decadence in all these people, right? There is also a constant pulsion, like the re-emergence in the characters of complexes of forces that, as we've seen, had already been manifested in other beings of their same lineage, like by Polissena. So Walpurgisnacht is essentially the predominating demon, is essentially the element again of the Dionysian that you need to evoke in order to tame it and to hopefully win in the struggle with it, which is a holy combat that I also described in some videos. In this sense, all this can be summoned only from the same earth that we know. This is why the clanic, the manic element is so important, because it's the one of the blood that fundamentally is all what we have from a material point of view to show how, vicious our nature can become, and so how dangerous it is to play with it evidently. Polissena is the youth that still has that force to spend. All Flugbile is the elderly that has basically exhausted it. It doesn't know how even to reactivate it anymore. So there is this terrifying irreconcilability between the two elements. This is the role that the so-called Avaisha here seems to play. The Avaisha, as we've seen in this practice, that allows not just to summon these forces, but to make other people acting through them, right? In other words, I can't control what the behavior of other people really does. It's as if you, by listening to me right now, were being possessed by my ovation that I was using to condition your thought. This is a very fascinating idea, right? It seems to be arising out of forms of exaltation, of irrepressible passion, of enthusiasm. So all practices of witchcraft that basically belong to the Dionysian trance that was used, in fact, also in the ancient war bands to again begin to start the initiation of the elements of the group that had, however, to be elevated further. So the idea presented by Meyrink here is that wherever men are carried away by something irresistible and irrational, which acts to their detriment, which we see constantly. So even when ideals and ideologies per se, as some kind of abstract thing that you can look at from a distance, seem to be the determining elements, a great avacia acts which we are actually unaware, which we perceive only in affects, that is, in states of mind that we believe are spontaneous while they are provoked, right? So this is an incredibly seducing idea from a political, moral, and scientific point of view, because, and this is perhaps the single most overlooked aspect of Meyrink's novel, that he's realizing that it's not really ideologies who we have to blame per se. It's the way simply we are, brought by them to obey. This force is, say, the ideologies are made by someone. This is what I mean. It's that there is not such a thing like an ideology. Nobody has ever read the Bible or Marx or whatever by saying, okay, I literally believe the same thing that is expressed here. There's never been a single Christian who believed the same thing. Never been a single communist who has believed the same. There's not been a single Nazi that has believed the same thing. Nobody does, right? So, as always, traditionally, it's always our fault, right, for what we decide to believe wrongly, right? Because we do not understand the entirety of the world. We never will. At least we would like to, in order to achieve this this transfiguration, but we're very far from it, and ever more. But we can look at the behavior, especially of the masses, that essentially, as superstitious as they are, so deciding basically that something has to be above them, they begin to act in this, as in the book, with this calamitous collective upheavals, fanaticized uprisings, even wars, right? The fact that the war is a bit like the background of this book, even though there is no real face of it whatsoever, would refer to an avacia. Headed by whom? Well, by forces from another side, seemingly, that however are always our own forces. So an occultist would say that there is another side. The traditional vision says that there is no such thing like another side. There's only one side, and the only reason why people believe in another side, such as Satanists do, is that they hope vainly that there is another side, while that is just the lack of a side, of the side, the lack of reality. That's why witchcraft was prohibited in all the great Catholic orthodoxies, the Roman Empire, the Christian Empire, and beyond, because all these cults were completely incompatible with any form of human attainment towards the divine. They were essentially, again, thinking that you depend just on matter, right? That's the point of socialism entirely, that the means of production come before humans, because humans are just nothing. They're just essentially a token that you can insert like a material object in the pile. It's just a class. It's something, that in fact, superstitiously speaking, is proven by the superstructure that is supposed to be tricking them into the realization that, again, allegedly they would be all matter, and that the superstructure is just nonsense because it's just to distract them from materiality. So what they should look at towards the dirt, not towards the sky. This is the entire point of Marxism. Of course, we want to destroy anything that even comes closer to the top, because any form of human worth would completely disintegrate any trace of socialism. And that sense of self-hatred that stems from the fact that you, as a fallen kind, has thrown in the towel the hope of saving yourself, and so you just want to destroy yourself as quickly as possible to get over with the suffering, right? Which is an extremely cowardly thing, and that's the reason why socialism spreads among the culturally underdeveloped people who become aware about their own inferiority, and and they start hating themselves and the rest of the world, their condition, etc. So this idea that the forces that somehow agitate these ones, and that are somehow part of the potential of mankind, at least as far as the brutal force of them is concerned. Again, it's like the revolution in the novel, right? It started, and then basically they get all shot, right? They managed to make a mess in the city, but simply logic, authority, discipline just wipe it out. So all this, and this is the, again, most provocative element of the book, is that all this would hide in the background in an occult way that we're not willing to recognize. In other words, the capacity of the Avaisha to control other people, right? And this sounds like actually a pretty logical concept, right? You have a set of ideas, of verbum, of knowledge, of logos that is able to move people, to command them, to create an empire, to establish an order. And there you perhaps can see all the weakness of the characters there, right? Even of wishful thinking, of merely like of ignorance, even, right? The young Polissena had barely knew what the Hussites were, but she was definitely mostly impressed with them, emotionally speaking, so gives way to them so easily, even though she seemed to be so virtuous otherwise, because just poor Apollonian elements cannot simply stem the Dionysian if they're not trained to do so. Right, the same reason why she gives way to the same Ottokar, sentimentally speaking. So some would find this a rather disconcerting theory, but one which is definitely useful if taken with a sense of measure and holding every rambling image in check for researching around this beyond, right, of everything that commonly occurs in what happens, and is interpreted only according to, again, there is a limited explanation. What basically science got down to materialism. At some point, the scientists in the world said, okay, well, we don't understand what life is, we don't understand what consciousness is, we don't understand what basically even existence is. So let's simply not study that, because it's, we just can't. And so they began to pretend that all the world can be just eaten bit by bit, and seeing if it makes any sense what you can just paranoidally measure in inch by inch without realizing that you actually have a power over the world, so that you can mold the world to your own image if you only give yourself the try and the power and the capacity and the experience, right, and the balance in all this. It's just a risky endeavor, but surely is the only way to boost further a power, a control, right? Again, this is interesting because Flugbile, for example, is a morally principled person. In spite of all, he is aware of what is going on. Again, is this somehow the most sane person? But he's still very weak because he didn't expose enough himself to the challenge. Right? He wanted mostly to live a quiet life without, or at least an easy one, without doing much more than that. So it's the greatest endeavors really have more merit, right? There is an interesting connection between Wilhelm Wundt's heterogenesis of affects, that is to say, the cases in which the results of determined actions are very different from the ends that we had proposed in undertaking them, so as to suggest that actually, I mean, you could explain all these influences. I'm not saying that they are just part of an occult that could not be explained scientifically, right? But definitely a fruitful field for investigation is existing here. Like, that is to say, what are the actual conjunctures between my action and say what happens from the other side of the world. This is the theory of chaos, right? So it's pretty obvious, right? The tradition has already explained this before anyone is trying to apply the quantum physics to diplomacy, thinking that we will solve conflicts in the world. Waiting for that. What about you actually getting to the world and try to see how it works? This is the entire deal of tradition in the form of command of the empire, right? Of course, mankind was much more aware about reality than we are today, easily, and what we did was just instead deluding ourselves that there is some sort of fixed, say, apparently explained but really unexplainable arbitration that would be supposed to make us say, okay, well, I will wait further until I die, that somebody discovers, I don't know, the cure for cancer, as opposed to living a life worth of this name, right? And so removing also the sense of guilt that derives from this, that is painful, and it is the same one that gets Flugbile killed and Polissena knocking at the monastery's door. But it's also the truth. It's also what our condition really is, right? I hear conservatives saying, what happens is not really our fault. I was listening to what was an interview to Tucker Carlson the other day because of the fact that they kicked them out of Fox or whatever. And he says, I'm a Calvinist in a way, at least. I don't believe that if somebody gets an illness, it's their fault. It's so stupid, right? There must be something predetermined that we can't change. That's the measure, of course, in the Reformation of the complete failure of mankind. Of course, the basically you give up the potential of the better self you can be in every single situation to say, oh, there's a point in which I have to stop and I don't even have to give a fuck about. Right? That's the reason why people cannot transfigure anymore. That's why so many people, so many nationalists and or socialists, even though they don't understand to be one, follow figures like Tucker Carlson that pretends, to solve the Ukrainian crisis with great, by basically bailing out and saying, oh, this was for the American interest, without any complete knowledge, competence, factuality, information, zero, right? I may like him, I don't dislike his nature. I may like him when he says, look, we should have more security in the streets. Okay, but if you don't know a fuck about how the world really works, and you go on saying things like, after all, there are certain things that are just determined with which we don't have fault. Don't you feel that you are basically withdrawing from your God-given power, You're just a weekly coward that is followed by such a large amount of people that feel the pathetic need to feel themselves conservatives, like the characters in the novel, where they're just basically the literal most disgusting scum of the earth, just like the leftists are, because they're basically the same thing, and they don't even know where to begin to understand that. Right? This is, I think, what Meyrink's work is telling us. Right? It's not to be self-flattering, right? To really make an effort to understand what your limits really are, and just to stop pretending to be a decent person, because nobody really is. If they have any care for the world, realizing that they will never do even a minimal fraction of what is enough in their entire lifetime, basically for anything in the world, what is going on in the world. You have the option of saying, well, I will just be a superstitious slave. And the other one is saying, I will even die in the enterprise, but I just don't give a fuck, which is essentially what Flugbile does in the novel. Naturally, I don't condone the suicide, because as I said before, it's just senseless. Because he gave up, right? But at least he realized that there are some things in the world that are really not what they seem to be, by importance, by relevance, by really what is needed to be a better person. And it's really a relatable character throughout the book, right? So there is no doubt that Meyrink's books are of indisputed artistic value. They're very important and arguably unmatched to a certain level, because in certain fields, especially for such insights that enable intellectually differentiated people to get more out of reading than a mere novel, right? So be aware what it is, because I think on a work like this you can simply measure the degree of how sensitive you really are. If you leave this novel by saying, well, but either I don't understand anything of what happened, or Flugbile was so cool because he managed to get himself killed, chances are that you haven't understood the book, and I don't think that was actually the point of Meyrink. But I don't even fully understand whether Meyrink was aware of this. I mean, all makes sense to me in this interpretation, and I think Meyrink may have easily been aware of that. It's just he doesn't want to tell us, because that's the point. If you don't see it, it means that you are not there, and that you need to be doctrinally initiated to really understand what the deal really is. And the beauty of it is that this is not such a the greatest masterpiece of a book, whatever. There are so many better books, but this one is good, I think. And it teaches you that you can find this meaning in everything, because this concept applies to every single reality, right? The way Meyrink makes you feel bad, anxious about reality, about existence, about time passing, etc. It's the same thing that reality basically shows you by herself every day, for any reason, even the canonically good ones that are going to end, for example, and why are they, and how can you replicate them, and what is that our entire deal here really is. So I really see a lot of positive insight in this book, and I recommend it if you want just to spend an easy week of read between work and other stuff, and you are interested in what some kind of, I admit, like, that when you read it, and at times every book, telling the truth, is never satisfying to the fullest, but that's exactly what the point of existence really is, right? That there is never a book that can tell you everything. This one can help in making you more aware about the picture. This is my interpretation of it. I'm not aware whether this seems the most doctrinally canonic, traditionally wise, right? It makes a lot of sense in the way that the reality there is presented to us, and it's supposed to work. I don't see really any other alternative in this. Again, the easiest alternative is to think that it's just, oh my god, there is another dimension and we have to get in there. You can't get in there if you don't pass through this one, which doesn't mean to pretend that reality does not exist, as again all the alienated kids nowadays are basically bought into this kind of self-sacrifice. Say you wish it was self-sacrifice, it was self-nullifying. It's just very different. Creed and cult about themselves, about just appearing, the mere appearance of everything, and not what it really is there, not as another dimension, but the essence of reality and how we play with it, which is a completely different thing. In any case, let me know what you think, and if you are interested in me just covering these topics, if you're interested in my reviews or anything. I think it can be an interesting alternative just to the usual history content, which is naturally always interesting, but can be enlightened even through this videos if you want. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.